All right, so hello everybody. It's good to have you with us, and it's good to have James Hall of Patz Hall Winery with us. James has an interesting story, and it's a little bit different than most of the stories that we've done in this series of interviews over the years. Normally, we've had people tell us how they started their business and talked about how they grew it and so on and so forth. James is different. He started a business, he sold it, he bought it back. I don't think I've ever heard that one before. So let's get right down to the meat of it. James, it's good to have you with us.
Hey, thanks, Joel. Appreciate you asking me to be on.
Well, good. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Where were you born? Where did you go to school?
I was born in Oregon. I'm a faculty brat. My father was a professor at the University of Oregon in Eugene, so my passport says Eugene, Oregon on it. My father moved to California to Santa Cruz to work for the University of California in Santa Cruz. So I moved to Santa Cruz when I was 9 years old and grew up there. That's where I got interested in winemaking. And I was a student at UC Santa Cruz, studying to be an anthropologist. Um, and at the tender age of 18 and a half, I realized that anthropology was not really going to be a future for me, and I cast about. My father gave me some very good advice. He said, go to the library, pull all the UC catalogs out, go through all the catalogs, and see if there's something that you're interested in. Because transferring between University Californias is fairly easy. And I did this a couple of times, and I ended up with the UC Davis catalog and fermentation science highlighted a couple of times, and I wrote them a letter, and by God, they let me in. And so I applied to UC Davis when I was 19 and a half, not even old enough to drink. I went up for my interview, and one of the professors showed me around, and he said, of course, we're going to be doing lots of winemaking and experiments here, but you won't be able to participate in that. And so when I finally started attendance, I was 20 years old, and I guess I acted old for my age because they never asked me if I was old enough to taste the incredibly terrible wine that they were making. But I went to UC Davis and immediately realized that I wasn't really learning how to make wine, and I returned to Santa Cruz and worked at a winery called Felton Empire Vineyards, located in Felton, California, up near Boulder Creek in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And my original thought was I was going to take the fall quarter off and do some hands-on winemaking, really to make sure that I was interested in this as a career. And at the end of my stage, Leo McCloskey, who was the head winemaker, asked me to stay on for the bottling season. So I was very interested in bottling, and so I did. So I stayed 2 quarters, and I realized that it was absolutely what I wanted to do with my career. So I went back to Davis and studied winemaking, and ended up moving to Napa, California in 1983, and became the assistant winemaker at a winery called Flora Springs Winery. Flora Springs was very typical of winery starting in the late 70s, early 80s. The owners had come from a different profession. The key owner happened to be the president of Bechtel Construction, which those that know the construction world, this was a very well-financed winery, and it was absolutely beautiful and new. And I started cellar work and bottling, and I worked there for 5 years. And maybe some of the happiest 5 years of my winemaking career. It was really wonderful. I had an absolutely great mentor, a guy named Ken Dice, who had worked at Joseph Phelps and Heights Vineyards, and he introduced me to Napa Valley winemaking, and I haven't looked back since.
Well, that's terrific. Let me back up just for a second because I also teach at a college. So, what
Oh,
discipline was your dad in?
well, he was a World War II vet, came back from Germany, and studied medieval English literature and got a PhD. And attended the Iowa Writers Workshop, and so he was a creative, and he taught creative writing, and so he started down that road, but eventually went into administration. He was the founding provost of College 5, which was built in 1967, 1968 at UC Santa Cruz. And so he helped with the founding and construction. That was the Aesthetic Studies College at UC Santa Cruz, which is based on the college system, sort of like Oxford. And so he managed the academic and administrative side. And so I was very lucky that I got to grow up in a beautiful place like Santa Cruz.
Well, that was luck, and good for your father. So let's get back to your story because we're not here to talk about your dad. We're here to talk about you. Um, you know, so you had this great apprenticeship, and you went to UC Santa Cruz, and when you got out of college, what did you do?
Well, I worked in a restaurant. I went back to Santa Cruz for that summer, and I was in fine dining. Worked at a restaurant called Hillary's, which was in downtown Santa Cruz, and it was based on this strange concept at the time called Nouvelle Cuisine. And so we had a very experienced French trained chef, Austrian trained pastry chef, and we served lots of small plates with lots of silverware and wine glasses. And the wine list was really something. We had, Premier and Grand Cru Burgundies and first growth Bordeaux's and vintage champagnes. And there were a lot of slow nights because it was very expensive, but it was really fun working in that environment. But I realized that, being a waiter was not going to get me where I wanted to be. So I sent out 11 letters to various wineries in Napa, and Flora Springs responded, and I went up, I interviewed, and they hired me on the spot, which was kind of today sort of an odd thought, but there I was, assistant winemaker at Flora Springs.
Well, that was terrific. So, uh, when do you decide to start your own winery?
Well, as I was working at Flora Springs, I met a fellow named Donald Patz. I was in the cellar helping make the wines, and he was hired as a national sales director. And as was typical, I think, in wineries, most of the people in wineries are quite social. So we would get together after work and go to the tasting room and have a couple of glasses of wine and talk things over, and maybe bring a bottle of wine in from home and see what Ken Dice thought of it, things like that. And we started having conversations about how we would improve the wines at Flora Springs. And how a sous chef probably has ideas about how to improve the executive chef's menu. Well, we spent, quite a few nights, discussing that. And one of the wines that Flora Springs made that was very successful was called barrel fermented Chardonnay. And I had traveled to Burgundy, and I knew something about the winemaking techniques in Burgundy, and I was very interested in trying some of these techniques on the Flora Springs wines. But Ken, the winemaker, felt that would be too much of a stylistic change, specifically putting the wines through malolactic. And so I sort of kept chomping at the bit a little bit, and one of the owners, Julie Garvey and Pat Garvey, had their own vineyard. It was a vineyard up on Zinfandel Lane planted with these muscat clones of Chardonnay. One of them was called Spring Mountain. And they said, we really want to have a single vineyard bottling from our own vineyard, and Ken doesn't want to do it because it's distracting for the wine program. Would you do it in the basement of our house? And I went to Ken and said, hey, Pat and Julie want me to make a couple barrels of wine for them. And he was like, sure, knock yourself out. So we pressed this juice, and I diligently filled 2 barrels, and we barrel fermented it with native yeast. And the pH was a little high on the juice, and the wine immediately went through malolactic, which was one of my objectives. And we let it sit on the lees for almost a year, and we bottled it by hand with a hand corker out of the barrel. And we called it Leapin' Lizards, which was a name that Pat and Julie came up with. We didn't have a label for it. And there we were with a pallet and a half of wine. And by God, it was terrific. It was so darn good. And we started pouring it around, and Pat and Julie started taking it to these parties, and it was a real showstopper. And so Donald and I got together and said, well, why don't we try this again with our own wine? And that was, sort of a haha, wouldn't that be great moment? Because we really had 3 significant problems. We didn't have a winery we could make it in. We didn't have a vineyard we could buy fruit from, and we didn't have any money. Other than that, we had a brilliant winemaking plan. And so a year went by, and I left Flora Springs to become the winemaker and vineyard manager at Honig Cellars. Honig Cellars was a small family-run winery in Rutherford, so very close to Flora Springs. And one of the principal jobs at Honig was that I had to manage their custom crush project, which was about 50% of the total tons that were harvested. So I made the Honig wines, and I also made wines for a handful of other customers. And so after a year there, I went back to the Honigs and I said, it's raise time. You were very generous with your $18,500 a year salary, but I'd like to propose a raise, and I'd really like $21,000. And they said, well, that's crazy. That's just way too much. That's a huge raise. And I said, okay, well, how about if you give me 20 and let me make my own wine? And they said, well, you can make your own wine so long as you pay all the custom crush bills and you don't make Sauvignon Blanc or Cabernet. And I said, done. We're going to make Chardonnay. They almost fell out of their seat. They thought that was the stupidest idea they'd ever heard. There was so much Chardonnay in 1987 that you couldn't count it. And it was a very challenging time in the wine business. And so there I was. I now had a winery. And I still didn't have a vineyard or any money. So over the period of the next year, Donald and I scoured the countryside for a Chardonnay vineyard. And we found one at Caldwell Vineyards. John Caldwell was making or growing grapes for a guy named Jason Paulmeyer. And Jason was producing a Merlot and a Chardonnay that were very, very widely thought of. And Robert Parker had become a real Jason Paulmeyer fan, particularly the Merlot. And Jason realized that he had contracted for the entire Caldwell Chardonnay block, but his Chardonnay wasn't selling as well as his Merlot. How's that for an odd bit of history? It should be the other way around these days. And so Caldwell said, well, tell you what, I'll just take part of Jason Paulmeyer's contract and sell it to you guys. So that's what we did. We now had the grapes and we had the winery, but we still didn't have any money. And so we went to John and we said, look, we really don't have a lot of money here. We scraped together $5,000 each, and this is how many grapes we can buy. And it was like 3.5 tons. It really was not much. And so Caldwell said, great, I love to see young guys get into the wine business. I'll sell you the fruit. And, so about 4 months later, John called us back and he said, Paulmeyer wants even less Chardonnay, and I can't find anyone to buy it. How about if I give you the rest of of his contract, and you pay me when you sell the wine?
Oh
And
my goodness.
we're like, wow, okay, so that's an interesting offer. Except we need barrels. We didn't have any money to buy barrels, and we were a little worried about making the custom crush invoice work. So I went to my father and I pitched him on it, and he was a little skeptical, and he loaned us $17,000. And he goes, "This is not a gift. This is a loan." He drew up loan agreement papers, and he said, "I'm going to do you a big favor and charge you 15% interest." And I was like, wow, that is a good deal, because people were getting 18 and 20% interest on loans, particularly if it was unsecured. So we were able to buy the extra barrels. We crushed the fruit, and that was the 1988 Patz Hall Chardonnay. We put it through fermentation. We initiated malolactic. We aged it surly, and we bottled it without filtration, unfiltered Chardonnay. And by God, it sold out like that. And so that was good news, because now we had the money to make the 89 vintage happen. So we repeated the process, and 1989 was a very, very difficult year in Napa. There was a large tropical storm that dumped 3 inches of rain on Napa in the second week of September, and botrytis and rot ran wild, and our Chardonnay fruit was pristine. We had picked it in early September before the rains, but our wine got tainted by the disastrous 89 reviews that were coming out. And so we didn't sell all our wine. And so we didn't have enough money to complete the 1990. And so in 1989, I had met a guy named Larry Hyde. Larry was bringing some of his Chardonnay grapes into Honig to be custom crushed. And I was extremely impressed by the quality of the Chardonnay. And Larry led on that he had not been paid by the guy that bought the grapes in 1989. And I was like, wow, so this guy's not paying you. What are you going to do with the contract? And he goes, well, I might be looking for a new buyer. And I stepped up and said, tell you what, I'd love to buy some of your fruit. And so in 1990, we had Caldwell grapes and Hyde Vineyard grapes in barrel, but we didn't have enough money to bottle it all. And so we went through the cellar and did a barrel by barrel selection of our wine, and we knew we had about enough money to bottle 40% of it. So every barrel we selected was Hyde Vineyard. That wine was still one of the best wines I've ever made. It was reviewed in the Wine Advocate with a glowing review by Robert Parker. Our New York distributor saw the review early, because they had this little sneaky process where they bribed one of the guys running the presses to mail them an issue of the Wine Advocate 2 weeks before it was mailed out. And they bought our entire 1990 vintage out of the warehouse and saved Patz Hall. We now had enough money to bottle the 1991, and we never looked back. It was really from the absolute jaws of defeat that we were able to carry forward. We paid my father back his $17,000, and we continued this goofy idea of making Chardonnay, selling it, and making another vintage. We didn't have any partners. We didn't have any debt. When I would tell my winemaking friends, they go, let me get this straight. You don't have a winery, you don't own any vineyards, you don't have any employees, and you don't have any debt. You call that a business? It was like, yes, it is. And that went on for almost 14 years. And at that point, we were making about 9,000 cases of wine, and we realized that we had to professionalize the company. And we hired a president and a CFO and a board of directors, and we grew up. The Peter Pan era was over, and that's when we really took Patz Hall to the next level. It grew quite rapidly after that, and we made it all the way up to almost 40,000 cases. which is very close to where we are now. So it was a strange and in many ways very, very lucky transformation from, you know, two families that really didn't know anything about running a business to having a 40,000 case winery that was very attractive for somebody to buy.
Well, that in itself is a fabulous story. I mean, it really is, and it was truly bootstrapped all the way too. So,
Yes.
you know, that should be an inspiration to entrepreneurs everywhere. You know,
Well, we learned so many lessons along the way. One of them was paying taxes. Now, we assumed that, taxes were based on profits, not based upon the difference between cost of goods and revenue. So we learned some harsh lessons along the way.
oh,
Oh my goodness. But at the end of the day, we muddled through and we went from making one wine, Napa Valley Chardonnay, to making 21 wines, only Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And so the original idea of not owning the vineyards and making relationships with vineyard owners is still the model we use today. We were forced to do that because we didn't have enough money to buy a vineyard. But the big question, we would play this fun game. What vineyard would we buy if we had, all the money we needed? And all the vineyards we wanted to buy were owned by people like Lee Hudson, Larry Hyde, people that were no way going to be selling their vineyards. And we came to the realization that if we had had enough money to buy a vineyard, we would have bought a vineyard that was for sale, and we would have been stuck with this thing. And it would have probably been of mediocre quality, and we would have had to come up with some mechanism for using all these grapes in our wine. By not owning a vineyard, we were able to be very discriminatory, to start relationships in a tentative way, start with small amounts of tons, explore which blocks and which clones made the best wines. And that's still the model today. When I go to a vineyard and consider, creating a relationship with this grower, it starts, with what kind of soil it is, what rootstock and clones, aspect, climate, but also what the objectives of the grower are. It's important that it's a partnership. I want to try to make, really, really good wine that I can sell for a nice price, but also as a way to show the world what this vineyard is capable of. And some growers are growing crops so they can pay their taxes, and others have a higher goal. They want to grow great grapes to make really good wine. And so that's really the differentiator often between a good vineyard and a great vineyard is the passion of the farming. And so that's a very important criteria. And then it takes a couple of years, maybe 3 or 4 years, even in some cases, to learn how to manage the vineyard and what crop levels and picking criteria, and also how to handle the grapes in the winery. So if a vineyard makes it that far in our portfolio, it's often been incorporated into our AVA tier wines, which are the Sonoma Coast Chardonnay and Sonoma Coast Pinot Noir. Kind of our farm league chance to put together a larger cuvee that we can sell nationally, but also a way to explore new relationships and new vineyards. And then from there, it'll advance to a single vineyard wine, often is the case. So that's how we ended up with 21 wines. We basically had all these tremendous vineyards that demanded to be bottled on their own. Anyone that studies sales and marketing would immediately see the problems with 21 individual vineyards because confusion by choice is not it's a reality in our portfolio. People are like, wow, I had one of your wines last week and I can't remember what it was, but it was great. I loved it. So we're still putting family names on the label. That's very, very important for us. So when you see one of our single vineyard wines, it probably has a name like Hyde or Chenoweth or Hudson, Pizzoni. So that's really the essence of our portfolio, is making the connection between the great vineyards and viticulture and our customers. I'm standing in the middle interpreting these grapes, and hopefully, there's a wine you love. One of the jokes we have is, if you don't like the current Patz Hall wine you're drinking now, wait 5 minutes. I've got another one. And so I can carpet bomb you with wines until you find one you like.
That that's just great. So you obviously were pretty successful, right? So how long were you running the winery before you got this tentative feeler that you might want to sell?
Well, 16 years was on our own, and then we hired our board of directors, and so we were we were merrily going on our way. And one of the things we had started doing was doing 3-year planning sessions. So every 3 years we would get the board together and we'd do an off-site meeting, and we'd solicit information from our distributors, and we would look very carefully at what our next 3-year plan was. Are we going to grow? Are we going to make more Pinot Noir, more Chardonnay, et cetera, et cetera. And so we had done that, and we had 3 outside board members that we would meet 4 times a year, and one of them left, rotated off the board, and went to work for a mergers and acquisition company by the name of Zapponi and Associates. So Zapponi handles a lot of wine business transactions here in the North Coast, and part of their business plan is they go out and talk to people and see if there's any interest in buying something. It's more or less like, let's go out to lunch. Are you looking for any acquisitions? So our ex-board member was in Washington State, and he met with St. Michel Wine Estates president, a guy named Ted Basler, and said, hey, here's our yearly lunch meeting. You guys looking to acquire any wineries? And at the time, Stag's Leap was the majority owner of, St. Michel was the majority owner of Stag's Leap Wine Cellars in Napa. The Antinori family were a minority partner, but they had a very successful winery at Stag's Leap. And they were like, well, we don't really have anything in Sonoma. We're looking for a Pinot Noir and Chardonnay producer that has high-profile wines in the Sonoma coast. And the Zapponi board member was like, well, like who? What do you have in mind? He goes, well, a winery like Patz Hall would be ideal. So came back to us, called the chairman of our board and said, hey, I just had lunch with Ted Basler, and he expressed some interest in talking to you about Patz Hall. Our chairman, Hank Salvo, called the partners together and said, hey, we just had this interesting conversation up in Woodinville, Washington. Do you want to meet with them? And we all said, no, we don't. We just went through this 3 years of planning. We spent a lot of money on it. We think we've got the tiger by the tail. We're not interested in selling the winery. And our Hank came back to us and said, well, you really should take this meeting. You're a small family winery. You're undercapitalized. Even if you don't want to sell the winery, you should take the meeting and see what they've got to say. You can always say no, but if you don't take the meeting, you don't know what you're missing. And then he pointed out a really relevant fact that as a small, closely held company, there was a big problem with finding valuation. Because we were 4 independent shareholders, and what's a 25% interest in Patz Hall worth? Well, one way to establish that is by having somebody make an offer for it. And so he pointed that out, and we're like, well, that makes a lot of sense. So we agreed to take the meeting, and it was like, wow, these guys are really interested in Patz Hall. And they sent us over an offer. And we said, oh, no, that's way too low. And then we sent them a counter offer. And St. Michel said, you guys have to be nuts. That's way too high. And they came back with another offer. And they said, by the way, this is our last offer. Leave it or, take it or leave it. So we had a 2-week period there of, shall we say, intense introspection. And as a group, we were divided. I was in favor of selling. My partner Ann was in favor of selling, and Donald Patz did not want to sell, and Heather was on the bubble. And so we had a board meeting, and Heather said, yes, I think we should sell the winery, so that's 75-25. By God, we accepted the offer, and there we were in due diligence. I was a little bit shocked that it had happened, but very excited about the future. I had had some sidebar conversations with St. Michel about what my role would be if I were to sell the winery. And Joel, it was a winemaker's dream come true. They gave me full creative control over the vineyard management and the grape contracts. They allowed me to buy whatever barrels I wanted in whatever quantity. They gave me control over all the blends. So I got to decide, basically what each of the wines was going to be. And they said, by the way, you probably need some new equipment to accomplish some of our sales goals. So write up a capital list and, try to be thorough and send it up. So I wrote out a list for close to $1.5 million worth of new winemaking equipment. And then I tacked on 3 new employees, and I sent it up to them, and they says, wow, this looks great. We thought it might be a little larger. So not only did I get essentially a refurbished winery, but an enologist, new forklifts, new presses, a new destemmer sorting line. And I said, well, what about all the sales and marketing? I mean, I have a lot of winemaker friends, and they spend half their life on an airplane going to sell wine. And they said, oh, well, you can say no to any trip you want. There's no compulsory travel. And I was like, send me the contract now, please, so I can sign this. And I tell you, it was fantastic, Joel. I didn't have to worry about taxes and bank loans and HR and sales goals and distributor issues. And I got to focus on wine and vineyards, and I did some traveling, but on my conditions, and it was fantastic. It really was. And so the wines got a lot better, which was one of my principal goals. And we continued to use my favorite vineyards. And so selling the winery was one of the best decisions I made. And if we had not made that decision, I'm convinced that we would have been put out of business by COVID. We sold it in 2016. 2018 was a very large, high-quality vintage, a super year, but most vineyards came in somewhere around 10 to 15% above estimates. And we bought all the grapes that were in these vineyards, and we had enough wine for 60,000 cases of wine in the barn. So that was a lot more than we intended to make. But St. Michel was optimistic. They were like, hey, that's good. We've got big growth plans. Well, COVID came along right after we bottled the 18, because we bottle almost 18 months after the vintage, and 65% of our accounts closed. We choked on that 2018. We ended up not selling very much of it, and if Patz Hall had still been the owners, I guarantee we would have thought, oh, COVID, it's going to be a 2 or 3 month thing, and we would have kept our employees on. We would have gone down. It would have been a Viking funeral. And so, as my father loved to say, it's better to be lucky than good. and we got very lucky that we avoided the COVID nightmare. And St. Michel paid everyone's salary. They paid our grape growers. I was so thankful for how they supported us during that terrible time, and it worked out. It worked
That
out.
that that in itself is an amazing story too. It's you were lucky,
Yeah.
absolutely
Yes.
lucky.
It was just terrible to see the fallout in our client base because we really specialized in independent restaurants. 65% of our wine was sold to on-premise restaurant accounts. And being a small family winery, you can imagine, we sold to a lot of small family restaurants, and those were the ones that were just mowed down. It was terrible. But that did lead us to another event. So St. Michel Wine Estates in Washington State in general ran into some severe problems starting in 2018. Sales of Washington wines were dropping precipitously. Washington was famous for making very high quality, affordable Cabernet. And as people started consuming less wine, they started moving up in price tiers. And the bread and butter $10 a bottle Cabernet category was falling by double digits every year. So St. Michel Wine Estates ended up overcommitted on Cabernet grapes, and they took some drastic actions to right the ship. But the parent company of St. Michel was a large Fortune 50 company that really didn't want to be in the wine business, but during the golden age was willing to cash the checks. But as the chickens came home to roost, they lost their appetite to keep their wine business, and they sold St. Michel Wine Estates to a private equity group called Sycamore Partners. So Sycamore Partners now own Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, Patz Hall, the whole Oregon portfolio, ERATH, and all the Washington State stuff. And they started to separate the entities. So Stag's Leap was its own brand. They put Patz Hall into its own LLC. They divided it into three different sections. There was the California portfolio, the Oregon portfolio, and the Washington portfolio. And that all seemed very logical. Patz Hall had been a totally owned brand of St. Michel Wine Estates, so we did not have our own balance sheet or profit and loss or tax return, but now we did. And so I knew something about private equity, and I thought, wow, so why did they put Patz Hall into its own LLC? Because that's expensive. Now we're paying our own taxes. The profit and loss is, right there. And about a year later, they sold Stag's Leap Wine Cellars to the Antinoris. That was a deal the Antinoris had been trying to do for several years, and they finally brought it over the finish line. And that was a very exciting time because the Antinoris, of course, the legendary Tuscan winemaking family, now owning one of the key foundational estates in Napa, was big news. I, of course, put two and two together and thought, wow, our HR, our direct to consumer, our finance, and our safety program are all based at Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. Now that the Antinoris own it, I seriously doubt they're going to want to do all that for us. I wonder what's going to happen to Patz Hall. I went to the management team at St. Michel Wine Estates and I say, hey, now that you've sold Stag's Leap, I'm curious to know what you're going to be doing with Patz Hall. Are you thinking about moving it into the Oregon portfolio because there's, Chardonnay and Pinot there? That would make sense. Or if you're thinking about selling it, I would consider making the transition as a consultant if the new ownership group was interested in hiring me. They said, great, well, we'll keep you posted. And I said, oh, and by the way, if you do sell it, I'd love to throw my hat in the ring. I've got some friends that are very interested in in Patz Hall, and who knows. So about 10 months went by, and this prospectus showed up in my email that had a lot of photos of Patz Hall, and by God, they were putting it up for sale. So I started talking to some of our wine industry contacts, and became a partner in a very small group, and we purchased Patz Hall. So we purchased it back from St. Michel, and that was in March of 2024. And I still pinch myself thinking that I'm now the largest shareholder at Patz Hall. I own more shares now than I did when it was a family business, but I have terrific partners, and we've now stood up Patz Hall as a fully operational family-run winery. We have a president and CFO, Elizabeth Harrell, who is just an absolute treat to work for. She is such a lovely person and one of the smartest people I've ever met. And she is doing a great job of managing the day-to-day and the finance and the taxes. And thank God for that, because the last thing I wanted to do was run a winery. I've seen that movie before. I want to make wine and talk to people about Patz Hall and get growers to try their hardest. I don't want to talk to banks about borrowing-based certificates. We hired a director of marketing. We hired a senior VP of international and national sales. We've filled out our staff, and now we have 21 employees. And I am very excited about the potential for our company. We have wonderful wines, great relationships with growers, a staff that has hundreds of years of wine experience if you add it all up, an ownership group that is very, very experienced. I've been in the wine business 40 years. My other partner has run one of the largest wineries in the world for 25 years. And the managing partner has been in the wine business for almost 30 years. So it's a wonderful opportunity to reclaim our family roots. And the reception has been absolutely amazing and gratifying. This story, I thought, okay, it's kind of unusual. It's going to last 3 or 4 weeks, maybe. And, there's going to be some new story to come along. And it has continued to attract attention and create focus on our wines and our brand in a way that I never imagined, Joel. And I'm incredibly grateful and thankful that people seem to care about Patz Hall in a way that they didn't for many years. And we are, a small independent family winery now, and for better or worse, we're making our way in the world. And I tell you, it takes a lot of friends and a lot of people to help make this work. And so I'm incredibly thankful that so far so great. Our sales are up. Our sales team is unbelievable, and we're focusing on small family independent restaurants again. And that's been very well received by the distributors. And so I can't tell you how exciting it is. It's fun stuff.
Well, James, when you decide to write your biography, I have a title for you. The title is Being Lucky.
That's funny because I thought the same thing when I purchased the winery back. I thought, how about the art of hanging around?
That too.
Because I can tell you from the very beginning, we were ready to walk away. I mean, we literally bet the house on this winery, and the 4 original partners, we had no money, Joel, and we thought, look, we don't have anything to lose. We roll it into the ditch at speed, hey, bygones. So now that I've got 21 employees, I have a lot more commitment to the success of Patz Hall. Let's put it that way. And so,
Yeah.
but you're absolutely right, getting lucky. It's funny because my father during World War II, his nickname was Lucky Jim. And I thought, well, isn't that great? You're the lucky guy, right? And he goes, oh no, it's terrible. Nobody wanted to share a foxhole with me. I was the lucky guy. The bullet wasn't going to hit me. And so he ended up with the Lucky Jim as something that I think he passed it on to me, but fortunately nobody's shooting at me. So
Well, that is definitely a good thing that nobody's
yeah.
shooting at you. It's better not to be shot at for sure. So, at this point, you've got your whole corporate structure in place, which is really
Yes.
good. Are you doing anything? I mean, are you like in a hiring mode or anything like that? Or are you really just set for the moment?
Well, we do have a couple of projects. 5 years ago, I talked St. Michel into allowing us to lease a vineyard. So we have never owned a vineyard at Patz Hall. I own two vineyards personally where I sell grapes to the winery, but the actual company does not. And so we leased a 14-acre vineyard in Russian River, an absolutely awesome site. And I planted it to Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, all of my favorite clones. And so now we have, in effect, an estate vineyard, and we're just starting to make the first wines off of that estate now. It's located in Green Valley on Green Valley Road, right next to a Dutton property called Dutton Ranch Green Valley. And it is a really, really nice site. So that's really fun. We're growing it organically, and I got to choose the rootstock and the clonal selections and trellis systems. And so that's really fun to see that come to fruition. And the other is our sparkling wine program. I started making sparkling wine method traditional in 2012. And so we now have three sparkling wines that a Brut, a Blanc de Blancs, and a Rosé. And about one of the few good things that came out of COVID for us is that it added a couple of years entourage for our sparkling wine. So now our sparkling wine is aging on the yeast for 7 years before we disgorge it. And those of your listeners that are familiar with champagne from France, 3 years is the minimum for vintage dating, but most tete de cuvées are 7 to 10 years on the yeast. So we're getting into that tete de cuvée tirage aging, and I did not buy grapes specifically for our sparkling wine. I went to our single vineyard Chardonnay and Pinot growers, and I started to pick part of our single vineyard wines early for champagne numbers. So we use vineyards like Hyde Vineyards, Martinelli Zio Tony, Gap's Crown, Dutton Ranch Old Vines, Pinot Noir from Blue from Two Dryers Vineyard. So we're using extremely high quality fruit, which is something that a lot of sparkling wine folks kind of skew away from. They tend to buy higher yielding grapes that are obviously cheaper and more profitable. The sparkling business is absolutely brutal, Joel. It's unbelievably complicated and capital intensive. You can imagine what it costs to keep 7 vintages of wine in my cellar, in a bottle even. So I can see why people are so price sensitive on their grapes. But our wine is different. It's got incredible minerality and acidity. The 7 years of yeast aging adds a whole nother level. So It's really exciting as a winemaker to get to work on sparkling wine.
Has your sparkling wine come to market yet?
It is available in small, limited markets. New York has some. California has some. Um, Georgia has some. But we are still. Originally, we were going to sell it exclusively from our tasting room. Um, and that's still where the majority of it is. But as we took over, Patz Hall and reconstituted it as a family winery, we realized that we had to stay very, very focused. So we did not focus on really talk about the sparkling wine at all because, we had a lot of other issues that we had to get in order to get to market. So now that we're going 2.5 years, well, 2 years really, we're going to focus on the sparkling wine, but we need to do it in such a way that it's not a burden to sell because there's only a certain capacity to focus on a brand, and you really have to be careful about distracting the sales team. And so we're formulating our strategy, and we want it to be available in 6 to 7 markets, and each market would have maybe 2 or 3 on-premise accounts that would sell it. So we're working on that. Very exciting though to have wines of that quality, and they're quite affordable, which is kind of a strange paradox.
Well, that sounds absolutely terrific, and I suspect you're going to be lucky on this one too. I'm beginning to
We'll
think you
see.
did inherit your father's gene, you know?
We'll see. Well,
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I was just going to say I may be lucky, but what I am most fortunate with is the relationships I've made in this business. I think there's this kind of romantic notion that the winemaker is this heroic figure that, is in the dark cellar making these wines, and it's a product of philosophy and labor, and that it's a personal creative project, and that's the furthest thing from the truth. It literally takes hundreds of people to make Patz Hall wines. All the family farmers I work with have their own family teams and their own farming crews. So on any day during harvest, I might have 100 people picking grapes for Patz Hall. I have a director of winemaking, a production manager, a cellar master, an enologist. I have outside consultants to help me with maintaining our equipment and our lab gear and viticultural concerns, because we do have a lot of input into how our grapes are grown and what the irrigation status and nutritional status and disease status is. So without all of these people, Patz Hall wouldn't be happening. So I'm very lucky to have these people that care about Patz Hall. That's where my real luck comes in.
Well, that's great. So uh, let's assume that instead of your dad being the professor, you were the professor, and you were going to
Uh,
tell a college student who wanted to become a winemaker, or at least go into the wine business, uh, your number one piece of good advice for him about the best thing that's happened to you, or the best piece of advice you would give him, what would that be?
well, the thing that's coming to mind versus so first I would tell them, how much money did you have to spend on this project, and what wine do you want to make? And then I would ask them why they want to make that particular wine. Does the market need that wine? Just because you like it and it brings you pleasure, is the market asking for this, or are you operating on the assumption that if you make good wine, people are going to come and buy it? That's a common myth there's an ocean of superb wine out there that is not selling. My advice would be to take half of the money that you have set aside, maybe a third, and buy wine with it and taste and refine your palate and learn about the world of wine and what great wine is and what wine you really want to make. And then start making wine on a couple of barrel basis just to see if you have the right vineyards and whether you can, actually produce what you're hoping to produce. I've met very, very few winemakers that can sit in a chair and imagine a wine and then actually create that wine. It is not a fully creative process. It's about actualizing the potential of the vineyard. The wine, who wouldn't want to make a bottle of Montrachet, for instance? That ain't going to happen, right? You have to work with the fruit that you can get, and you have to be sensitive to that, and you have to maximize the vineyard potential, not simply produce some sort of elaborate, self-aggrandizing project. And then I suppose the last piece of advice was don't do it. Take the money you were going to spend on making wine and travel the world and take some vacations and drink well. And because it's an extremely challenging time right now in the wine business, Joel. I'm very fortunate. I get to travel, and I often, go to countries that have wine businesses and wine histories, and I've never seen it more challenging. There are an ocean of unsold grapes throughout the world. You name it: South Africa, Argentina, Uruguay, Australia, California, Europe. Spain has almost 30% of their grapes that are going unpicked. Italy, Hungary. There's such a huge oversupply that sure, maybe you're a winemaking genius and you have a great vineyard and you can make 300 cases and it's going to sell. That's always possible. Alternatively, you're going to have to go sell that wine yourself because the distributors are not going to take your brand. I think it's a little bit like, advising somebody who wants to open a restaurant. They're a great cook. People love, their personalities. They have range. They have experience. They've got a location. But do you really want to own a restaurant? Do you really want to own a winery? And if the answer is yes, well, give me a call. I'll give you some advice. But please don't do it.
All right. So now my next question is, looking back on your career, which I guess spans what, 40 years now? I think you said. Uh, what would
My
you
first
say?
vintage was 1980.
Okay. That would be 20, that would be 45 years. This is starting to
Yes.
sound like a real career. Um, what Thinking back on that time, what would you say was the biggest mistake you've made?
Hmm. Biggest mistake I've
Yeah, this is hard based on your story, I think, probably to come up with,
hmm.
but
Well, um, that's a tough question to answer when I'm on the record because the good news is I've survived all of my mistakes. Even though some of them have been existential, we've recovered. So I'm not quite sure how to answer that, Joel. I would say, I've made a couple of questionable hires, maybe some employees that I would, rather not have hired.
well, fair enough. Let's
Yeah,
talk about that. What do you think is the quality of a good employee, or what made those people bad hires?
well, part of it is personality and fit. Um, Winemaking is a little bit like being on a boat. You spend a lot of hours, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of equipment and machinery. things don't always go as planned. There's a lot of breakdowns, there's a lot of compromises and scrambling. And so, I have certain ways of doing things that, are not particularly efficient, but I feel make better quality wines. So, having somebody on the team that believes in the wines we're making and understands that it's not just an operational food science project, that we are trying to create wines of emotion that give people pleasure and joy. And, not everyone sees it that way. And the other aspect is not only do I want all of our employees to be, really, really good at what they do, but to have like a love of wine, where sharing a great bottle of wine is important. And that's kind of somewhat elusive, um, but that's essential. And I've got certain personality traits that I'm sure some people find irritating. So, you gotta, it's a relationship. And I've been very lucky. The people that have worked for me have been very successful. Um, I've worked with quite a few assistant winemakers and folks over the years, and many of them have gone on to great success in the wine business. It's one of the things I'm most proud of. I think people learn a lot when they work at Patz Hall. I am more the type of manager that encourages people to take the job on and do it. I'm not a micromanager per se, but I do like to keep people focused on the end goal. And I'm plenty eager to jump in and kibitz and say, now, why did you do it that way? I don't think you thought of this. Have you considered that? What if we did it this way? Which can be kind of irritating to some people, I can say. But overall, the number of great hires that we've made at Patz Hall far outweighs the personality conflicts that arose with a couple of people.
Well, that's great. And the last question I have for you is there any question that you wish that I had asked that I haven't asked?
Oh, that's an excellent question.
This is a question that keeps me humble.
Well, let me think about that. Um, well, it's tempting to go to some of the nuts and bolts of the wine business. I've been on the inside of this crazy circus for a long time and got a lot of insights in how to make a winery work. But those probably are not as interesting to your listeners as something that's decidedly more romantic. Um, and um, I really can't think of anything, Joel. You've asked a bunch of good questions, and I've prattled on far too far, far too long about this. Um, so I think I'd say we covered a lot, and I really enjoyed ourselves here.
Well, we have covered a lot. I'm very grateful for your time, James, and I really appreciate it. So we've been chatting with James Hall of Patson Hall, who has done something I've not heard anybody else do recently, which is start a winery, sell it, and then buy it back, which is a pretty good trick. And I guess this is the start of his second career as a winemaker. And we wish him a lot of luck with this one, and I'm sure he will have it. So, James, thank you so very much for your time. We really appreciate it. And I'll send you a copy of this when we print it. So, thanks so
Joel, what a
much.
what a pleasure, Joel. It's been delightful speaking with you, and thanks for your patience as I prattle on about ancient history. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, sir. Take care. Have a very great day. And goodbye, everybody. We appreciate you tuning in.
I know.
Thanks, James.
See you, Joel.